Have you ever been in a situation that's just so twisted, so complicated, that even trying to explain it makes you sound like you're the one who's losing it? Well, that feeling, it has a name. Today, we're diving deep into a really subtle but powerful form of manipulation called reality distortion layering. We're going to look at how it buries the truth, one tiny, seemingly reasonable layer at a time.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll uncover what we mean by the buried truth. Then we'll look at the architect's blueprint, how this whole thing is built. After that, we'll walk through the three-step deception, get into the psychology of the hunger for a story, and then finally, we'll talk about how you can start reclaiming your reality.
All right, let's jump right in. The whole thing really kicks off with a paradox. See, we're not talking about one big dramatic lie here. No, this is something way more insidious. A kind of slow erosion of what's real that starts with something that sounds, well, perfectly reasonable.
And here's the absolute key to understanding this. A manipulator, a controller, they never start with some giant, unbelievable lie. That would be too obvious. Instead, they just ask you to accept thousands of tiny, and this is the important part, reasonable adjustments to what you know is true. We always think deception is going to be this one big moment, right? But this is different. It's so gradual, it's almost invisible. Each little tweak feels like a small compromise you make, maybe for the sake of peace or to keep a relationship going, until the original version of reality is just buried alive. That's the end game. Your brain's natural drive to make sense of the world, to have a coherent story, gets turned against you. Every tiny adjustment is like a paper-thin coat of paint. But you add thousands of those layers, and pretty soon, that paint becomes an impenetrable wall, and your own memories are trapped inside.
And this is what leads to that feeling, that question you might ask yourself. Why does my life feel so complicated that nobody else could possibly get it? You know, that sense of isolation is a huge red flag. It's that point where the backstory has become so convoluted, so filled with you had to be there moments, that trying to explain it just makes you sound completely paranoid. The complexity itself becomes the cage. So this is the core paradox of what some researchers call iterative erosion. It's where your very human, very natural need for a story that makes sense gets weaponized. You actually start participating in your own deception because you're trying so damn hard to piece together a narrative that was specifically designed not to make sense. You, in a way, become an accomplice in bearing your own truth. So, okay, how is this fake reality actually built? Because it's not just random chaos, it's a meticulously designed system. You can almost think of it as a kind of epistemic architecture, a blueprint for a whole new version of reality, specifically designed to replace your own stable memories with this constant, confusing blur. Now, the technical term for this building process is strategic narrative accretion. Accretion is just a fancy word for a gradual buildup of layers. And in this case, it means layering special knowledge or extra context over every single contradiction you find. Anytime you point out something that doesn't add up, boom, a new layer of explanation is added to smooth it right over. And this isn't just some abstract theory. We see this pattern pop up in very specific, high-pressure environments. You know, think about visionary cults, where a charismatic leader is constantly adding new layers of truth to explain away any failed prophecies or inconsistencies. Or really enmeshed family dynamics, where sticking to the family story is way more important than what actually happened. And it's an absolute hallmark of high-control relationships, where one person's reality is just constantly being overwritten by the other. And the goal of this whole process, it's a really profound transformation. It's about taking a sovereign individual, someone with their own clear, stable timeline of their life, and turning them into what you could call a narrative subject. As a narrative subject, your focus completely shifts. You're no longer living your reality. You're just constantly trying to make sense of the controller's latest story, the latest layer. Your own past becomes this moving target that's always being recalibrated to fit whatever they need it to be today.
So you might be wondering, how does this trap actually work on a psychological level? Well, it exploits something called the coherence hook. That's our brain's deep, fundamental need for stories to make sense, for things to add up. And you get hooked on this belief that if you can just find that one last piece of the puzzle, that one bit of context that keeps dangling in front of you, then everything will finally click into place. It's a brilliant trap because it uses your own intelligence against you. And the end result of all this is a state of what's called foundational instability. And this goes way beyond just mental confusion. People in these situations often report feeling physically dizzy, disoriented. You start to fundamentally distrust your own senses because you've been conditioned to believe that you lack the proper context for what you're seeing and hearing.
You literally stop trusting your own perception of the world.
This leads to a really critical realization. In these dynamics, the endless demand for more and more context isn't about finding clarity at all. It's a weapon. The context isn't an explanation. It's a social fortress that's used as a cage for your sanity. It's designed to be so incredibly complex that no one on the outside could ever possibly understand, which isolates you and makes you completely dependent on the architect of that fortress.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics. How does this machine actually work? Because it's not random. Research shows there's a systematic three-step process that hijacks a person's ability to reason and locks them into this manufactured reality.
It really happens in 3 stages. First, you have the baseline distortion. This starts super small, a tiny omission, a slight change to a story. It's really just a test to see what you'll let slide. Then comes step 2, the contextual overlay. So when you question that little inconsistency, you don't get a straight answer. Oh no. Instead, you get a whole new layer of story, a secret, a hidden motive, some special reason you weren't aware of. This is designed to hook your brain's need for a good narrative. And finally, you get to step 3, the total immersion lock. After enough of these layers pile on, the story becomes so complex that digging all the way back down to the original truth, it just feels exhausting. It actually becomes cognitively cheaper to just accept the new reality than to fight it.
And what this creates is this devastatingly effective feedback loop. The controller adds more context, which makes you mentally exhausted. That exhaustion then leads you to lock in and just accept their narrative because you just want some peace. And then, your acceptance is used as proof that their super complicated version was the truth all along. You see, it just fuels itself.
To really get this, we have to look at the psychology that's driving both sides of this equation. It's not as simple as one person being bad and the other being gullible. It's really about 2 very powerful and tragically compatible human needs that are colliding.
So on one side you have the controller, who is driven by this need for what you could call total narrative monopoly. By controlling the past, by paving over history, they get absolute leverage over the present. I mean, you can't really argue with a history that's constantly being rewritten, right? And on the other side you have the target, who is driven by our deep human need for meaning. They can become conditioned to believe that a deep, complex story is somehow more valuable than a simple, clear life. That complexity starts to feel like intimacy, when really it's just the architecture of control.
And the biological lock on this cage? It's something called confirmation bias. It's just a mental shortcut our brains take. Once our brain accepts a story, it actively starts looking for evidence to support it, and it will ignore, literally not even see, anything that contradicts it. It becomes almost impossible to spot new inconsistencies because your brain is already working overtime to defend the story it has invested so much in.
So given this really powerful psychological machinery, how in the world do you break free? How do you start to dismantle this structure? Well, it all starts by shifting from being a passive consumer of someone else's story to actively, radically trusting your own perception. It's all about reclaiming what we can call your foundational sovereignty.
So this really is the key question, isn't it? How do you interrupt the cycle and get your own reality back? The answer isn't about winning an argument with the controller. It's about using internal tools to see the architecture of the manipulation for exactly what it is. So the research points to 2 really powerful tools for building awareness. The first is what's called a first principles audit. This just means stepping back from all the crazy, complicated layers of context and asking one simple question. Does the absolute core of this story make any sense? Is all this nuance I'm being sold actually just pavement being laid over a simple, uncomfortable truth? The second tool is independent ledger awareness. This is the practice of intentionally keeping a private, untouchable timeline of events in a journal, a note to a trusted friend, something the controller can never ever access or edit. It becomes your anchor to your own perception. And ultimately, reclaiming your reality, it all boils down to this one simple but incredibly powerful statement of sovereignty. I don't need context to know what I saw. This is the sentence that breaks the spell. It's the recognition that your direct perception of an event is valid all on its own. It doesn't need layers of someone else's interpretation to be real. It interrupts that whole cycle of confusion before the burial can become permanent. And that leaves us with this one final, crucial takeaway. Complexity is the shield of the liar. Real truth, it's often simple. It's visible, it's stable. When a situation requires endless layers of context and secret knowledge and special interpretations just to make it make sense, that's a red flag. The most dangerous cages out there aren't made of steel bars. They're made of context. Your mind is your own territory, and awareness is the key to making sure that no one else's architecture becomes a prison for your life.